as the woman wended her way through the crowd to get to Jesus. She moved in the way that had become habit. After more than a decade of practice, she had learned how to move without letting her garments touch anyone, lest they become unclean as she was. As the widow followed Jesus, what might she have been thinking? Did she wonder whether the rumors about Jesus were true? Was Jesus a healer? Could he cure her illness? If the rumors were true, all she needed was to touch him. That would be enough to cure her. But she would have known that touching any part of Jesus, even just the hem of his cloak, would make him impure, unclean, as defiled as she was. And she would have known that if she were caught, her punishment would be severe. The stakes were high. The widow slipped through the crowd as invisibly as she could until she got close to Jesus. In spite of the risk, she darted out her hand. Just the lightest of brushes, the merest whisper of a touch, hoping no one would notice. Perhaps even before her hand left the fabric, she felt the difference. She knew she was cured. It had worked, and no one had noticed. She breathed a sigh of relief, no cries of alarm. Her risk had paid off until Jesus noticed. Until Jesus noticed power leave him. Someone had received his grace. Jesus whirled around, eyes probing. "Who was it?" he asked. The disciples scoffed. "It could have been anyone," they said. "Look at this crowd. Let it go, Jesus." With what courage then? With what inner strength did it take for this woman to admit that it was she? This dangerous widow, this pariah, whose slightest touch polluted the body of another, fell down before Jesus in humility. Shaking, she confessed. The crowd surrounded her, all eyes staring at her bent head. All fell silent. All waited for the show to start, for Jesus to chastise, berate, and preserve his honor by demanding her punishment. Freeze the scene. What had the widow hoped for? Well, she hoped to be cured, of course. She hoped for an end to pain and discomfort. She hoped for an end to her suffering, an end to the relentless search for a physician who knew what to do, an end to the side effects of remedies that promised everything and delivered nothing. But underneath all that, she hoped for more. She hoped for more than a cure. She hoped to get back to normal life. A cure would mean she could go home. A cure would mean she could return to her family. A cure was an end to illness, and that was fantastic, but the real goal was to be healed. In Jesus' day, to be healed meant people were brought back together again. Those estranged were reconnected. Loved ones torn apart were reunited, and beloved members of families were returned to them. A bleeding illness had rendered this widow perpetually impure. This prevented her from living with her family, chatting with neighbors, praying in the synagogue, and sharing the news at the market stalls. She was disconnected, isolated, and shunned, a social pariah. She and her family and her community all suffered her absence. If she were cured, all would be healed by being reunited. If she were cured, healing would occur when she stroked her daughter's hair again, snuggled with her grandchildren, and touched the wares at the market again. She wanted a cure, yes, but she wanted the cure so she and her loved ones could be restored to one another. The only way for all of them to be healed was for the widow to be cured. Return now to the scene. The widow is trembling on the ground, and the disciples and the crowd are hushed, waiting for Jesus' response. When it came, probably all but the widow were sorely disappointed. Rather than get the entertainment the crowd hoped for, to watch Jesus demand her punishment, Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith in God has healed you. Go in peace and be made whole from what plagues you." Jaws must have been on the ground. Jesus didn't seem to notice that the widow's touch had made him impure, or if he did, he didn't care. His concern was to cure her so she could be healed and her family reunited. And the first sign Jesus had cured her and that healing had begun would have been to see her walk through the crowd without squeezing her arms in tight to her body, without drawing in her garments, without holding her breath to make herself as small as possible. For sheer joy, she may have flung her arms out wide and twirled her garments so they brushed every knee as she danced past. If the crowds parted to make way for her, it would not have been in fear of contamination, but astonishment to have witnessed a miracle. The widow needed to be cured of an illness for her family to be healed. But what about those in need of healing, but who are not ill? Those who are longing to be restored to relationships, but are not diseased? What if the person who had sought Jesus' healing was a Samaritan woman, or a tax collector, or a Roman soldier? There is no illness to being a Samaritan. It is not a disease to be a tax collector or a Roman soldier. And yet the crowds would have parted for them because they were seen to be as much or even more of a pariah than the widow had been. The crowds would have loathed to be touched by them and would never have talked to them unless forced. What if it had been a Samaritan woman then, instead of this ill widow who approached Jesus in this crowd to seek healing? What if a Samaritan woman had sought a cure for being seen as a social pariah? What would be the cure to heal fractured relationships? The cure for those who silenced others with glares of contempt? The cure for those who lauded some and devalued others? What would have happened if a Samaritan woman had sought healing from Jesus, not for an illness she carried, but to cure the disease of tacit agreement the crowd carried? What if the cure she asked for wasn't for an illness she harbored, but for a disease the crowd harbored toward her? What if the one who needed to be healed wasn't the woman, but the crowd? Today, crowds of people agree with one another about who the social pariahs are, and it's not so tacit. It's openly discussed on social media, in newspapers, and the halls of our highest political offices. Hearing themselves so openly disparaged, people are taking enormous risks and refusing to make themselves small and protect the crowds from them anymore. It's as if Jesus has touched the hems of their garments to infuse them with hope and courage. They stand tall beside him, openly and in faith, refusing anymore to stay silent, blend in, or make themselves small. They stand next to Jesus to remind us that our human family is ill when it believes that anyone is a social pariah. Our human family is diseased whenever we claim that the image of God is represented in some, but not others. Our human family is sick with arrogance whenever we say that some deserve less than we ourselves receive. Sometimes it takes the one who has been labeled as the pariah to remind the crowds that the crowd is the one in need of healing, that none of us is whole without all being united. Sometimes it takes the one who is well to remind the crowd that we all need to be healed and reunited by God's saving embrace. Healing follows the cure. Sometimes we are the widow who needs to touch Jesus' hem. And sometimes we are the crowd. Sometimes we need the faith and courage of the one who has never been sick to remind the crowd that it is they who need to beg for Jesus' cure.